Welcome to the Truth Chronicles, where lies have become the truth and the truth remains hidden deep down the rabbit hole. Lies have become pervasive in every facet of our lives, so much so that were you to expose people to the truth today, the snap judgment would be to judge the truth as a lie. So sheltered have they been from the truth their entire lives. In banking, U.S. and Western banks regularly lie about their financial viability today with creative accounting measures that would make even the most corrupt of Enron's accountants puff their chests with pride. In our re-education system, lies invade almost every facet of economics and history, and youth are taught to believe in economic principles that allow bankers and governments to continue their lies en masse today. In politics, presidents and prime ministers regularly tell lies to the masses to gain their trust and their votes, and their lies have zero negative consequences even after they are exposed as such. People are further duped into believing they have a choice in elections, but all presidents and prime ministers around the world are selected, not elected. For an entire century now, lies have been applying the rear naked choke on truth and winning the battle. But the tides are turning today, and truth has started to gasp for air and make a comeback. If there is one thing bankers fear above all, it is the truth. Recall the words of Henry Ford. It is well enough that people of the nation do not understand our monetary system. For if they did, I believe there would be revolution before tomorrow morning. For precisely this reason, bankers have been spreading lies through our academic system and through our political system, so much so that lies have become our new truth. It is time for truth to make a comeback, and through truth, we will regain all of our God-given freedoms that bankers have stolen from us over the past century. So let's start with one of the biggest lies that governments propagate all around the world, and that is the lie of democracy. Most people, actually, one way you can see that this lie has pervaded the thought processes of society is even just to listen to what some of the Occupy Wall Street protesters have been chanting recently in America. And recently I saw a video in which the Occupy Wall Street protesters were chanting repeatedly over and over again, "Show me what democracy looks like." So from gathering from this protest and their chants, you would believe, or tend to believe, and I think it's a safe assumption, that these protesters are for democracy and believe that democracy is the best form of government. Now, that's what governments would have you believe. But I would have to say that you have to know your history. So if you know your history, you know that America was founded as a constitutional republic, and that those that founded America were actually diametrically opposed to the concept of democracy. And that is why they founded the U.S. as a republic, as well as many other countries in this world were also founded as republic. Now, a lot of people don't know, but there is a marked difference between a republic and a democracy. Although a lot of people think they are the same entity, it is not. A democracy is a far inferior form of governance than a republic. So a republic is basically governed by a charter, whereas in a democracy, it is the majority that rules. So when we look to our history, for example, when we look to the Federalist Papers, which was a series of 85 articles and essays that were written at the time anonymously in order to protect the authors from retribution from those that supported tyranny versus freedom. And the Federalist Papers were also the precursor to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Now, today, is widely known that the authors were Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. But one of the most important papers of those 85 articles and essays is widely accepted right now as Federalist Paper number 10. And that was scripted by James Madison. Now, in those papers, James Madison basically went on to say why the concept of a democracy is so dangerous. And he said, quote unquote, let me read you the quote, that factions would be dangerous because it's easy for factions to develop under a democratic form of government. And he defined a faction as, quote unquote, a number of citizens, whether amounting to a minority or majority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion, or of interest adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So Madison also argued um, against democracy because he said under democracy, he said the property rights and the freedoms of individuals cannot be protected. Now, it wasn't just James Madison that argued against democracy. Even the great Greek philosopher Plato argued in his book, The Republic, that democracy, he only rated a democracy as a form of government one step below tyranny, because he said democracy was the form of government that would lead to tyranny inevitably. So herein lies a problem with democracy. If you think about it, where the majority always rules, this actually can lead to a concentration in the power pyramid scheme where only the top 1% make all the decisions for an entire country. But even under a straight democracy, if 50.1% of a populace desires something and 49.9% do not want the same piece of legislation, then the 49.9% are overruled. And basically, the 50.1% get their way. So, any way you look at it, that's not really a good form of governance. But on top of that, you can see in a democracy where the charter of a republic that's supposed to govern a republic can basically be rendered an irrelevant piece of paper if those that are running the country, the elite 1% or 5% in a country, basically seize all power. And that's what we see today because there are basically principles of the U.S. Constitution that are broken daily by our government. So that is the danger of democracy. It allows power to concentrate in the hands of just a few elites where the majority of a country actually have no say in how the country is run. Now, the kicker to all this is that democracies, even though they're not the best form of governance, and I would much rather favor a constitutional republic than over a democracy, democracies don't even exist in the world today. Show me one country that actually runs a democratic government, and because I would think you'd be hard-pressed to find one. For example, if you look at how democracy, the principles of democracy is supposed to run, just look to the 2008 bailout when both the president and the U.S. Congress overrode the overwhelming majority of people's desires about the bailout plan when you had $700-800 billion being taken from U.S. taxpayers and basically used to recapitalize all the corrupt banks. Well, at that time, it was reported widely, not only through the mainstream media, but the independent media, that congressmen at the time were receiving calls from their constituents 99-1 against the bill. So you had 99% of the people voicing their opposition to the bill and only 1% saying, go ahead and give the bailout money to the corrupt banksters. And yet, what happened? Congress overrode what the people wanted, the president overrode what the people wanted, and gave the money to the corrupt banksters anyway. So even so, you can see how democracy right now has been bastardized, and there is no true democracy. And what we have instead is an oligarchy or a plutocracy where only a few dozen men and women are making the decisions for everyone in the country, irregardless of what the people in the country want. Now let's look at the process of democratic elections that we supposedly have all around the world, because I will argue that all presidents and prime ministers around the world are selected rather than elected. I believe that all elections are just an illusion to basically soothe the sheep and to appease the masses, to give us this illusion of choice when we really have no choice. And what I mean by that is that if we really had a president or prime minister in the world that served the people, then they would immediately receive opposition from the elite in power. So that is a clear way to understand if the president or the prime minister is serving the people, is that if the elite voice no opposition to this person, then that means that this person is serving them and not the people. Another way you can look at it is if the people are benefiting, and not the people meaning the rich, I mean the middle class and the poor, are the middle class and the poor better off today? Just ask yourself that about any president or prime minister today. Are the middle class and are the poor better off today than when this person took power? Now, there are a lot of people that will serve as apologists for current presidents around the world and current prime ministers, because they will say, oh, it was the person that preceded them that was so bad. And it's true that people need time to fix a problem, but if the situation is markedly worse for the middle class and the poor, that should tell you alone that, if they were seriously fighting for the people, besides the fact that, the current presidents and prime ministers around the world have no opposition from the elite in power, that if things are not even turning the corner and getting better, but if they are markedly worse, which is the case all around the world in many countries for the middle class and poor, that this means that president or prime minister is only continuing the policies of the president and prime minister that preceded them. So when I look at it, the last president to receive in America, since I'm American, I can say this from the American perspective because I know American history the best, that the last president to really receive very stiff opposition from the elite in power was John F. Kennedy. And look what happened to JFK and how he ended up. And I believe every president and prime minister that served the people would have this very, very stiff opposition, because one has to judge a politician not by their words, but by their actions. So, for example, like President Vicente Fox in Mexico, again, another prime example of a leader that brought so much hope to the Mexican people, because he was the first Mexican president that did not come from the Revolutionary Institutional Party, all right? Or is it the Institutional Revolutionary Party? I believe it's the Institutional Revolutionary Party. Sorry, I got that backwards. So otherwise known as the PRI. So he was the first president not to come from that particular party, and I believe it was like 71 years. So he brought a lot of hope as far as reform, but just a couple of years into his presidency, many of his key cabinet appointees resigned because they said they did not even recognize this man. They did not even recognize this man who basically spouted all these principles just to get elected. And they said after he got elected, he was a completely different person. So again, you have to see that you have to understand that presidents and prime ministers all over the world have a higher master, that they are not the most powerful person in that country. There's a higher master above them, and that higher master is the ruling banking families in that country. And if you don't understand that, actually, I'll post a link, you can see in the information below, to an article written by Simon Johnson, who was a former chief economist of the IMF. Now, I know a lot of people don't trust the IMF, and rightly so, because they, again, are just a banking institution that serves the elite. But note, I said former, because no person can speak out against the institution as long as they are working for them. Many times the whistleblowers come after they leave an organization, or they're forced to resign or fire from that organization if they whistleblow when they're currently with that organization. But Simon Johnson, after he retired from the IMF, basically came out and he wrote a very important and critical article that explains how bankers have commandeered all governments today. And it's not the governments that are in charge, but the bankers are in charge of their country. So I highly, highly recommend that you read that article. Again, I'll post the link in the information to this video below. So as an example of this, you can look at, say, the United Nations, who a lot of people, I shouldn't say everyone, because a lot of people understand that the United Nations is really no different than the World Bank and IMF, and is a nation that fights for the elite, even though they say they fight for the poor. And they certainly do have some programs that do fight for the poor, but that's just a front for the overall overarching mission of that institution, which I believe is to fight for the elite and to oppress the poor. So when you look at like instances of basically institutionalized laws like diplomatic immunity for UN employees, why should we hold an organization that's supposedly working for humanity to a much lower standard than the average citizen? Because if you think about it, all diplomatic immunity does is to encourage criminal behavior. If you're a good person and you're confronted with a situation where someone comes to you and say, hey, you can engage in criminal behavior and never be prosecuted, and you can make all this money from doing it, would you not be more encouraged to partake in that illicit criminal behavior than if you were granted no diplomatic immunity. So that's an instance where I could say, from a logical standpoint, just think about what is the motivation for the United Nations giving their employees diplomatic immunity? Why should if their high level officials are going to engage in upstanding, honest, courageous, admirable behavior, why do they need to be granted diplomatic immunity? They only need to be granted diplomatic immunity if they're going to be engaging in illicit criminal activity and need to be saved from being prosecuted in that country from this activity. And then who benefits from it? Who benefits from it? High level officials in the UN. So what does that say about the United Nations as a whole? So again, this is just one way you can cut through all the fat of all the lies and get to the visceral muscle of the truth, is to understand, ask yourself two questions whenever something seems to be a very questionable policy among institutions or governments. And I would also say that, and this is one thing that sparked some hope within me from the Occupy Wall Street movement, is that people are realizing that good change will only come from themselves. They cannot rely on the government to make change. You look throughout history, right? When has there been a historical precedent where a government basically uplifted its own people? You look at how did India free itself from British colonial imperialistic rule. It was Gandhi that affected that. It wasn't the Indian government. How did South Africa free itself from apartheid? It was Nelson Mandela that did that. How will Burma eventually reach a peaceful, hopefully, republic? Because again, I'm against democracies. How will Burma eventually reach that? It will be through Aung San Suu Kyi if it happens in the future. So know that self-reliance is also key to restoring our freedoms in the future as well. So in the instance of a country where a bankster is not in control of the government, say in Burma, where a military junta, an oppressive military junta, is in control, we still see that a democratic process will not work, because in the most recent elections, Aung San Suu Kyi overwhelmingly won the prime ministership of that country, but shortly after winning the prime ministership, the military junta invalidated the results and forcibly removed her from power and put her under house arrest, which she has been under house arrest for 15 of the past 21 years. So, unfortunately, when the elite rule, if a leader does come to power through a democratic process, such as Aung San Suu Kyi, the elite will either forcibly remove that person by arresting that person, or even worse yet, try to assassinate that person, or never let that person basically reach office by fixing an election. But the one thing, and again, I want to emphasize, our greatest weapon against the banksters and the monetary system and the immoral monetary system is the truth. So the one thing that banksters cannot imprison is our mind. So as long as your mind remains free, and as long as your mind remains open from the pollution of propaganda, then you will always have the initiative to learn about the truth and understand what the truth is.